This video is brought to you in part by Ground News. More on them later. On the 9th of September 1934, the front page of the Detroit Free Press read, "And to you, Mr. Greenberg, the Tiger fans say, Leshono Tovo Tikvosevu," which means Happy New Year. It was a celebration and a warning. Originally from New York, first baseman Hank Greenberg had scandalized his middle-class parents by dropping out of NYU to sign with the Detroit Tigers. Those who knew him said he wasn't a natural athlete, but he was big, loved the game, and made up for his shortcomings through endless study and practice. He also had a reputation for being difficult. Most players of his generation came from poor rural backgrounds and had few other options in life, which made it a lot easier for team owners to push them around, especially since baseball players were exempt from most labor laws. But the Bronx-raised Greenberg constantly held owners' feet to the fire. By the end of the decade, he'd be the highest-paid player in the game. Later still, he'd be one of only 2 team owners to side with labor against the major leagues. In 1934, Greenberg had yet to make the All-Star team, but he was clearly on his way, and nobody appreciated this more than Detroit's 75,000 Jews. Thus the headline. The Tigers were scheduled to play on Rosh HaShana, the Hebrew New Year. With the team in a tight race with the New York Yankees for the American League Championship, they'd need all the power they had, and Greenberg was on a hot streak. Would he come to bat for his team, or take the day off? Greenberg wasn't devout, but his parents and many of his fans were, and he didn't want to disappoint them. But if the Tigers fell behind without him, he feared retaliation against Detroit's Jews. In Germany, the Nazis had already been in power for more than a year. Detroit was the hometown of anti-Semitic car magnate Henry Ford, as well as the headquarters of Father Charles Coughlin, a Canadian Catholic priest who'd made his name broadcasting anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi propaganda on his syndicated radio show. The stakes were real. Greenberg compromised. He would play on the New Year, but abstain a week later for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement and the holiest day in Judaism. With 2 home runs, Greenberg was the only player to score for the Tigers that day. The next week, he arrived for Yom Kippur services and received a standing ovation. The Tigers went on to win the pennant, and although they lost that year's World Series, Greenberg's status as a titan of the game was secure. That winter, he invented the webbed glove. 1935 was Greenberg's real breakout season, tying for the lead in home runs and leading the majors in runs batted in and total bases reached. For dumb political reasons, he still didn't make the All-Star game, but by the end of the season, it wasn't hard to find comparisons to the recently retired Babe Ruth. It's hard to grasp now just how much this meant to American Jews, especially kids. There were lots of Jewish celebrities at the time, but it wasn't the same. Everybody loved the movies of the Marx Brothers, but they were funny, and being funny was a way to compensate. Edward G. Robinson changed his name to sound less Jewish. Musical duo Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart had made the jump from Broadway to Hollywood, but they worked behind the scenes, as did Irving Berlin, and George Gershwin would soon be dead. Greenberg was tall, athletic, and attractive, 100% American and 100% Jewish. If you were a Jewish kid in your school and your classmates gave you shit, you invoked the name of Hank Greenberg. Because he'd made his career as an athlete, Greenberg had never experienced the kind of casual anti-Semitism that most middle-class Jewish men did. There was plenty of ethnic ribbing in the clubhouse, and as one of only 8 Jews in Major League Baseball, Greenberg got more than the typical share. And he had lots of experience with racist hecklers and opposing players during his time in the minor leagues. But nothing compared to what happened in that year's World Series. Over the course of the first 3 games, at least 6 members of the National League champion Chicago Cubs hurled anti-Semitic abuse at Greenberg every time he came up to bat, to the point that a fight nearly broke out between the 2 teams. No one alive today knows what they said, but it was apparently so bad that 3 of the offending players were ejected, and no one present ever repeated their words. I can't even imagine what they said, and I do this for a living. Though the attacks died down, Greenberg was still under enormous pressure. Would he abstain from playing in Game 6 for Yom Kippur? But then, a miracle happened. After complaining of pain in his arm, Greenberg discovered that he'd broken his wrist back during Game 2. And when Yom Kippur came, the Tigers managed to clinch the series without him. Detroit was ready for its biggest celebration ever. Factories that had once closed were reopening under new management. Alcohol was legal again. The Tigers had won their first World Series, and Greenberg, soon to be elected that season's MVP, was a hero to Jewish America. As it turned out, he wasn't the next Ruth, but in the years to come, he'd get pretty close. While Greenberg appreciated the love he got from the Jewish press, he resented the condescending way mainstream outlets fixated on his Jewishness, particularly their tendency to compare him to other Jewish players who weren't anywhere near his level. Today's game only has a few more Jewish players than in Greenberg's day, and we don't see the same attitudes from the press. But bias, even political bias, can play a big part in how sports get covered. That's why I use ground news. It doesn't just show you headlines, it goes deeper and shows you the bias, factuality, and ownership behind over 50,000 news sources from around the world. One of my favorite features is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that one side of the spectrum covers but the other side mostly ignores. Most sports news tends to get broad coverage, but look at this story about the legal fight against a ban on trans athletes in Nassau County, New York. Almost all the coverage has come from the center and left, often emphasizing that the lawsuit is backed by groups like the New York Civil Liberties Union, while the right-wing Washington Times emphasizes that the court's suspension of the ban is only temporary pending an ongoing appeals process. Seeing those blind spots can completely change how you understand the news. In 2025, Ground News has endorsements from everyone from Jon Stewart to the Nobel Peace Center, so check out what all the hype is about. Go to ground.news/Sam Aronow or scan the QR code to get 40% off the same unlimited Vantage plan I use. The link's also in the description. By subscribing, you won't just be getting a seriously useful tool, you'll be supporting independent media and helping me keep doing what I do. Let's set the stage. The United States in the 1920s had undergone a decade of ultra-conservative government overseen by reactionaries in Congress and presidents who were reserved to the point of negligence. Deregulation, corruption, easy credit, and tax cuts for the rich were the order of the day. And it all came to a head on the 24th of October 1929, when the bubble burst, stock values plummeted on Wall Street, and the Great Depression began. The president at this time was Herbert Hoover, a moderate Republican from California who'd made his name as a great humanitarian. Though paradoxically, he was also a notorious elitist who maintained his party's unpopular support for the prohibition of alcohol and was elected president at least partly because his opponent was Catholic. Working with Congress, his main response to the crisis was to defy the advice of economists by signing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising prices on imported goods. Since U.S. manufacturers no longer had to compete globally, consumer prices rose while other countries imposed retaliatory tariffs, not only on the U.S. but on each other, which tanked global trade and turned the Depression into the catastrophe we know today. As the Republican majority shrank in the 1930 elections, Hoover found himself under pressure from liberals to increase federal spending. The government had a huge backlog of infrastructure projects that had never broken ground due to a shortage of available workers. With unemployment surging, that was no longer a problem. Hoover also made up for lost revenues by raising taxes on the rich. But without dramatically more spending, the economic impact was minuscule. Across his presidency, GDP fell by nearly a third, and unemployment rose from 3% to 25%. The money supply collapsed, while homelessness and hunger became regular features of American life. It was this low point that brought unexpected popularity to the song "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" by Jewish-American songwriters Jay Gorney and Yip Harburg. Enter New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A distant cousin and nephew-in-law to the late President Theodore Roosevelt, he'd served under President Wilson and ran for vice president in 1920 before being stricken with a paralysis that largely confined him to a wheelchair. Despite the stigma around his disability, Roosevelt's more progressive, anti-corruption brand of Democratic politics proved very popular in New York, particularly with former left-wing Republicans who'd followed his cousin Teddy out of their party in 1912. Only to find themselves locked out of mainstream politics in the 1920s. Nominated by the Democrats for president in 1932, Roosevelt's New Deal platform built on policies he'd implemented as governor and promised to restore the American economy for the benefit of the poor and middle class through a combination of economic stimulus, sweeping reforms to the financial sector, and the establishment of a European-style welfare state. Assembling an unexpectedly durable alliance of middle-class progressives, socialists, trade unions, and racist Southern reactionaries, Roosevelt and his congressional allies swept the elections.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
Taking office in March 1933, Roosevelt engaged in a massive overhaul of both foreign and domestic policy, enacting virtually any part of his campaign platform that Congress would authorize and the Supreme Court would allow. Ever since the Spanish-American War, the United States had been constantly intervening in Central America and the Caribbean, mostly on missions to protect American agricultural interests, which antagonized other countries but brought little benefit to the U.S. economy. So Roosevelt declared a good neighbor policy and began withdrawing U.S. troops from the region. This wasn't just about being nice. Establishing good relations was essential to restarting global trade. Ever since its formation, relations with the Soviet Union had been limited to humanitarian aid and individual agreements between Moscow and American businesses. Formal recognition of the communist state had been taboo. But by 1933, that was no longer the case. So in November, Roosevelt finally normalized relations. The following year, Congress effectively repealed the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariffs and global trade began to rebound. Finally, Roosevelt and Congress resolved the question of America's largest colony by granting democratic home rule to the Philippines and setting it on a path to independence. Whereas Hoover had obstinately ignored the emerging consensus against prohibition, Roosevelt had touted its repeal as part of his economic plan. The new Congress didn't even wait for him to become president before passing a proposed amendment to end the policy, and just 9.5 months later it was ratified by special convention. The reopening of breweries and distilleries was an immediate job creator, and by losing their largest source of revenue, gangsters found it much harder to maintain their power. The National Crime Syndicate would persist for decades, but it was a shadow of what it had been during the halcyon days of Prohibition. But his main focus was the New Deal. In practice, it was remarkably similar to his cousin Teddy's New Nationalism platform from 1912, and it boiled down to the 3 R's. First, relief. By the end of Roosevelt's first term, the government had introduced farm subsidies to stabilize food prices, mortgage assistance for homeowners, a minimum wage, a right to unionize, unemployment insurance, and modest pensions for the elderly and disabled. Second, recovery. The same month Roosevelt took office, British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that governments should be willing to take on deficits during recessions and depressions in order to put people to work and stimulate consumer spending. And though his theory faced strong opposition from most Republicans and conservative Democrats, it would play a major role in the recovery. By far the most popular recovery program was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which recruited single men mostly to carry out environmental projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority was the largest of several initiatives to build hydroelectric dams and provide electricity to poor rural areas that had never been connected by private industry. And the Works Progress Administration didn't just do standard infrastructure like highways, but funded civic beautification projects like statues and murals, and sponsored theater, graphic design, and even historical research. Finally, there was reform. If previous governments bore responsibility for the conditions that enabled the Depression, Roosevelt saw it as his government's responsibility to ensure it never happened again. After initially closing banks to stop people from taking out all their money, Roosevelt's allies in Congress created the FDIC to ensure people's accounts up to a certain amount, tied banks to the Federal Reserve System, and established a strict separation between commercial and investment banks, with its own enforcement agency in the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is by no means a comprehensive overview. These are only the most significant reforms of Roosevelt's first term. There were many smaller programs and reforms, and some of his most ambitious proposals either couldn't get through Congress or were shot down by the Supreme Court. But it was still a lot, and the effect was immediate. GDP began to rebound, and unemployment, though still high, fell sharply. Uncharacteristically for the president's party, voters actually increased the Democrats' congressional majority in the 1934 midterms. In 1936, Roosevelt was re-elected with over 60% of the vote, while Democrats and allies to their left won an unheard-of 3/4 majority in both houses of Congress. The Depression and New Deal touched every aspect of American life in the 1930s, and it's important to understand that. So with that in mind, let's get back to Jewish history. By the 1930s, over a quarter of all Jews now lived in the United States. Over half of those lived in just 3 cities, but large communities could now be found all over the country. And due to the restrictive immigration laws passed in the 1920s, almost all of the community's growth in that decade had resulted from native births. Jewish America was in a weird place, but so was most of the country. On the one hand, popular culture was awash with a new generation of talent, mostly the children of immigrants or people who'd immigrated as children during the melting pot era, and naturally that included a lot of Jews. At the beginning of this video, I gave the Marx Brothers and Edward G. Robinson a hard time for not being as muscularly Jewish as Hank Greenberg, but they were still immensely popular. Jazz clarinetist Benny Goodman was becoming a legitimate sex symbol on par with later icons like Sinatra or Elvis. Al Hirschfeld's cartoons for the New Yorker still loom large over our memory of this period, and in 1938, Cleveland boys Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel created Superman, launching the new genre of superhero fiction. Yet this period was also the peak of American anti-Semitism. Though Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were broadly unpopular in the US, it was still a big country with a lot of people. And the Nazis' rise to power in Germany encouraged American anti-Semites to broadcast their bigotry in a way that was previously limited to the KKK or pseudo-intellectuals like Madison Grant. I need only point to Father Coughlin. This came on top of the more traditional, institutional anti-Semitism that had existed in the country for decades. Like most Americans who weren't of Northern European descent, Jews were prohibited from living in many towns and neighborhoods due to racially discriminatory housing practices. In fact, Jewish housing was even more segregated in 1930 than in 1920. The exact degree of segregation varied by location and social class, but even Jewish bankers, lawyers, and publishers were routinely blackballed from advancing their careers at WASP-owned firms or joining WASP-run social clubs. Resort hotels in places like New York's Catskill Mountains often refused Jewish customers, leading them to start their own resorts in the region, and many of the country's top universities continued to impose strict limits on the number of Jewish students. Even the American film industry became more culturally conservative. A generation removed from the melting pot, the upward mobility of Irish, Italian, and Polish Americans helped fuel a vocal minority of Catholic extremists, whose anger with Hollywood cinema's perceived immorality overlapped nicely with film studios' desire to exert control over politically outspoken filmmakers. This culminated in the Motion Picture Production Code, or Hays Code, which prevented studio films from depicting profanity, nudity, homosexuality, interracial relationships, or mockery of religious authorities, and discouraged depictions of violence and criticism of foreign governments who might otherwise want to show Hollywood movies in their countries. With the hardliners still dissatisfied, the studios agreed to enforce the code through the Production Code Authority and censor Joseph Breen, an outspoken anti-Semite and sometime Nazi collaborator. The Hays Code didn't stop Hollywood from making great movies, and people like Breen certainly didn't represent the feelings of most American Catholics, but we should recognize the degree to which the code was a particular product of 1934, which is a big reason why its enforcement steadily faded. Despite all this, Jews and others continued to stand up against this bigotry, and against attempts to normalize fascism in America. Most famously, the American Jewish Congress and Board of Deputies of British Jews jointly declared a boycott of Nazi Germany, which faced initial skepticism but quickly spread all over the Jewish world. It's probably worth examining President Roosevelt's own relationship with the Jewish people. Born into a wealthy family descended from New York's earliest Dutch settlers, Roosevelt took pride in having no Jewish ancestry whatsoever, or at least no more than the average European. During his hiatus from politics in the 1920s, he helped Harvard institute quotas limiting the number of Jewish students, and though he abandoned ideas of white supremacy, he remained a casual anti-Semite for the rest of his life. Even as president, he imposed strict quotas and extra qualifications on Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Nevertheless, Roosevelt rejected political anti-Semitism, worked closely with Jews in Congress and his administration, and enjoyed overwhelming support from Jewish voters, winning 82% of their vote in 1932 and 85% in 1936. During the 32 campaign, Roosevelt actively supported Herbert Lehman's bid to succeed him as governor of New York, and assembled a rotating brain trust of academic advisors which always had at least one Jewish member. One such advisor was speechwriter Samuel Roseman, who actually coined the term New Deal. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's lone Jewish cabinet member, played a critical part in the New Deal, and country boy David Lilienthal was appointed to lead the Tennessee Valley Authority. Later on, Roosevelt appointed Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court. In 1932, Father Coughlin endorsed Roosevelt on his radio program in the hope that he would be America's Hitler. Thankfully, he was disappointed. At the same time all of this was going on, Jewish American communities found themselves increasingly concerned with matters of religion. Those of you familiar with this channel might find that strange. Unlike most countries in the Old World, Judaism in the United States had never labored under a central authority. Any attempts to establish one were consistently rejected by the public, and any affiliation between synagogues was strictly voluntary. With each congregation acting independently, the new liberal streams of Judaism coming out of Western Europe flourished, with lively debates and lots of colorful personalities. But at the end of the day, they were still following the Europeans' lead. Any new developments that came out of American seminaries reached no further than Canada, and basically conformed to schools of thought across the pond. Then, between 1881 and 1914, nearly 2 million Jews immigrated to the United States, far outnumbering the existing Jewish population. Most of the new arrivals came from Eastern Europe, where liberal streams had never taken hold, and Judaism was much more of a binary. Either you were ultra-Orthodox, or you weren't religious. And though this had surprisingly little impact on American Jewish thought, it still changed the religious landscape. Without a central authority to fund their operations, American synagogues relied on membership fees which most working-class immigrant families couldn't afford. And though this didn't prevent them from attending services, it did keep them from the social and educational benefits that membership offered. Combined with Eastern Jews' more polarized attitude towards religion, synagogue attendance plummeted. By 1916, just 12% of American Jews were affiliated with a place of worship, an unheard of number for any other group. Nevertheless, by becoming home to the largest Jewish population in the world, America's future as the new center of Judaism was all but certain. That future arrived in the 1930s. Orthodox Judaism faced the greatest danger. Most immigrant families of the 1900s and 1910s had embraced secularism in their new home, and without a steady stream of traditionalists from the Old World, the number of Orthodox congregants could only shrink. For those who are new here, Orthodox Judaism describes a few different Jewish streams who refuse to make decisions on Jewish law conflicting with a 16th century textbook series called the Shulchan Aruch. But unlike so-called ultra-Orthodox streams, modern Orthodoxy, or Neo-Orthodoxy, embraced the separation of religion and state, and encouraged Jews to engage in things like democracy, fashion, popular culture, and Western-style education. Its origins were closer to the more liberal streams, and had been virtually the only form of Jewish orthodoxy practiced in Western Europe or the Americas since the 1820s. Even in the 1930s, that was still the case. If the rabbinic traditions of Eastern Europe had any place on this continent, it was within a modern Orthodox framework, and the man responsible for bringing that to fruition was Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Though born into a dynasty of Lithuanian rabbis that stretched back centuries, Soloveitchik graduated from a secular high school, majored in political science at the Free Polish University, and was only ordained as a rabbi after immigrating to the US in 1932. Approaching the crisis of orthodoxy like an engineer, he chose to make his home in Boston, a city with very little Jewish history prior to the 20th century, as a kind of laboratory. His efforts culminated in 1937 with the Maimonides School, which modeled itself on American public schools, adopted English as the primary language of instruction, put boys and girls in classes together, and brought girls into religious study. It was a huge departure from the cramped, old-fashioned yeshivas of Eastern Europe or even New York. Conservative Judaism first emerged in the 1840s out of frustration with Reform Judaism's lack of a coherent philosophy. Though it superficially resembled modern orthodoxy, the conservatives differed in their approach to Jewish rituals, conceptualizing them as symbolic gestures rather than impactful actions. By the Great Depression, the conservatives were the fastest growing Jewish movement in the country, as well as the most organized. Sometimes in conversation, I like to compare conservative Judaism to the Church of England, and upon further research, that's exactly what they were going for. In that spirit, the United Synagogue harbored ambitions to establish their form of Judaism as the national stream. But before they could, the conservatives descended into a ferocious debate over the treatment of women and girls. In conservatism, as in orthodoxy, women sat in an upper level of the sanctuary separate from the men, and married women required permission from their husbands in order to execute a ritual divorce, or get. But the harsh realities of the Great Depression challenged traditional gender roles as never before. The more families struggled with poverty and joblessness, the more members of those families had to go looking for work, the women as well as the men. So even as unemployment remained high, the share of women in the workforce grew. Over the same period, religious Jewish women began attending synagogues at a higher rate than men, so you can understand why their status within the conservative congregations was such a problem. Some individual synagogues relaxed their rules, but the United Synagogue remained deadlocked until the 1950s. Without meaningful leadership, the most radical dissenters began coalescing around a man whose rise to prominence was just as improbable as Soloveitchik's, but whose contributions to Judaism were even more revolutionary. Mordecai Kaplan came to America at the age of 9. His father, though an Orthodox rabbi, encouraged him to think critically and challenge authority, and thus sent him to study religion at the conservative Jewish Theological Seminary. Simultaneously, Kaplan studied ethical philosophy at Columbia University, exposing him to the ethical culture movement of fellow Jewish skeptic Felix Adler. As his personal philosophy matured, Kaplan not only broke ties with orthodoxy, but found himself leading the most radical faction of the conservatives. From his perspective, the supremacy of the Shulchan Aruch prevented Jewish orthodoxy from answering the challenges of modernity. It could only evolve by becoming more strict. And though the conservatives rejected orthodoxy in principle, they hadn't done much to distinguish themselves. Kaplan summarized his views in his scholar's prayer. From the cowardice that shrinks from new truth, from the laziness that is content with half-truths, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, O Lord of truth, deliver us. Conservative could no longer describe him. In his eyes, traditions that couldn't withstand scrutiny weren't entitled to be conserved. Judaism could only truly be conserved if it was first reconstructed. In 1922, Kaplan established his own synagogue, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, where he officiated the first modern bat mitzvah for his daughter Judith. Jewish initiation ceremonies for girls had some historical precedent in Italy and Iraq, but those traditions had long since faded into obscurity. The bat mitzvah of today is firmly a Kaplan invention. In 1934, as the conservative movement became paralyzed, Kaplan published his manifesto, Judaism as a Civilization. Building on the Jewish studies movement that had originated a century earlier, Kaplan defined Judaism to encompass Jewish culture in its entirety. Through exhaustive critiques of orthodoxy, conservatism, and reform, Kaplan advanced a new program which denied chosenness, denied the supernatural, embraced tradition but never blindly, venerated Jewish peoplehood without separatism or chauvinism, and established an ethical and cultural framework with which Jewish civilization could continue to evolve. Officially, what came to be known as Reconstructionist Judaism didn't break with the conservatives until 1955. It remains a small niche movement. Doubtless many of you have never heard of it until now, and even I've never encountered it in the wild. Many in the Jewish world consider it heretical, an existential threat not only to the Jewish contract with God, but to our very existence as a people. But they all have bat mitzvahs. For most of the 19th century, Reform Judaism had been the country's most popular school of Jewish thought. It had also remained bitterly divided between moderates who favored the aesthetics of Jewish tradition and radicals who rejected Jewish ritual entirely, disavowed Jewish culture in almost all its forms, eliminated the Hebrew language from their services, and fixated on the distillation of Jewish thought into a pure moral philosophy. If conservative Judaism was Jewish Anglicanism, radical reform was Jewish Unitarianism. Reformers in the 19th century had dreamed of uniting all American Jews under their banner, culminating in 1885 with the ultra-assimilationist Pittsburgh platform. In many ways, the platform was an expression of fear that the oncoming wave of mass Jewish immigration would drown American Jewry and ultra-Orthodoxy. And though that didn't happen, by the 1930s, the reformist position was dire. By 1918, only 2% of synagogues in New York City were Reform. By the 1930s, it was almost exclusively the domain of wealthy, long-established families in California and the Midwest. In Judaism as a Civilization, Kaplan eviscerated reform for its sterility and elitism, regarding it as an intellectual dead end. As with orthodoxy and conservatism, reformists had to reckon with their historic attitude toward women. The movement faced intense criticism over issues of class. And though reform had rejected Zionism at its inception, the Zionists had come a long way since the 1880s. By 1930, only 9% of students at the Reform Hebrew Union College remained steadfast in their opposition. But perhaps the greatest challenge to radical reform was the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Reform had originated in Hamburg and was profoundly influenced by German nationalism. In its rejection of Jewish peoplehood and dismissal of most Jewish culture, 19th century radicals like Abraham Geiger believed that their movement would disprove and eradicate anti-Semitism with facts and logic. But anti-Semitism wasn't a logical belief to be disproven, and if a century of advancements in psychology, sociology, and political science hadn't already made that clear, the rise of Hitler did. In May 1937, the Central Conference of American Rabbis met in Columbus, Ohio to work out a new manifesto for reform. Like the Puritans of old, the radicals effectively voted themselves out of existence. The new Columbus platform recognized Judaism as the expression of a Jewish people and accepted the cultural and social role of the synagogue. Without denying the equality of Jews in diaspora as citizens of their home nations, they endorsed Zionist aims for the establishment of a cultural homeland in Palestine, if not necessarily a Jewish state. The new platform renewed the Pittsburgh commitment to social justice, but with a more populist edge and a Rooseveltian emphasis on labor, the welfare state, and the struggle for world peace. The Columbus platform saved Reform Judaism. It also set it on a much more traditional course. Even the moderate reformists who wrote it would seem alien to Reform Jews today. In 2025, radical reform exists only as a straw man in the fevered imaginations of far-right Jewish extremists. By early 1934, Bertie Schenker could no longer enjoy the luxuries of her childhood in Cleveland. The end of Prohibition had forced her bootlegger parents to close the family restaurant and move to the more affordable suburb of Shaker Heights. 2 years later, Bertie prepared to finish high school and begin her studies at a prestigious art school when her parents announced that they would leave Ohio for greener pastures. She never received her diploma. Instead, the family sold almost everything they owned, bought the cheapest train tickets they could find, and boarded an ancient, run-down train with no air conditioning on a long, slow journey to California. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.